Hello, H students. Like I said, if you were in class, after looking over the Ed puzzle and some of the questions that you had, I decided that this would be the best way to facilitate and get some of your questions answered. So I've written a couple down and I've broken them down by each topic or by each Ed puzzle, and I'll kind of go through those now. So the first one from the 4 causes of ecological problems. Some of you asked questions about virgin resources. And just to be clear, when they're talking about virgin resources, they're talking about the raw materials. So this would be like mineral ore or wood. So these are things that can, because some people asked about if they renew, they can renew over time, but they take a really long time to do so. Especially something like metal ore is going to take hundreds of thousands of years to replenish or to be renewed. The other one that was pretty common was the difference between the whole analogy with ecological principle and ecological interest. For that one, it's just saying it's essentially like Earth's overshoot day, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But we want to make it so that we don't dig in extra from what we have for resources. So like the example that's often used is, say that you're given $1 million and you find a bank that will give you 10% interest a year. Well, if you do the math at that 10% interest, you could spend $100,000 a year and never dig into that $1 million. You'd just be using the interest. And we kind of use this to think about Earth's resources. If we just take the amount or that $100,000, we never touch the underlying stuff. So we're not digging away at something. Because if we start digging away at that principal or the original $1 million, then the next year we don't have $10,000 to play with. So then we're slowly dwindling down our interest that we can use. So that's all that's talking about. For Earth's overshoot day, so just this is like it's essentially a hypothetical thing that represents the date when we as humanity will exhaust nature's budget for the year, how much it can give us for that year. This is something that started being looked at in the 1960s-ish. And in 1970 was actually the first year where the Earth's overshoot day was less than a full calendar year. So it was in the middle of December. I'm not sure on the actual date, but ever since then, it's actually gotten earlier. And the earliest time that it's been since we've been keeping track of this was 2019, where we had an overshoot day of July 29th. So kind of like right smack dab in the middle of the year. One interesting thing that happened is actually because of COVID, the overshoot day dropped for the first time since 1970 and was August 22nd, I believe, this year. So it was moving the opposite direction. And some of that stuff was because of us having less impact or using less things during that time. So an interesting thing to think about. The last thing from this talks about natural capital and natural services. And some of you asked, is there any way to put some kind of monetary value on natural services? The easy answer is not really. It's a difficult thing because what somebody sees, so if we're thinking about a park, somebody's value on that park is going to be different from one person to the next. And there's no real consensus on what a monetary value or how much money that would be towards one person or to a whole. So there's no real monetary way to put any kind of value on those natural services. So next is sustainability. So in the sustainability one, a couple things that I saw, because, well, it goes with that whole like ecological impact. Some of you asked like, what are some things that we can do to lessen our ecological impact? And hopefully after doing that ecological footprint, it became a little bit more clear. But some of the things that have been touted by different ecologists and environmental scientists for decades are doing things like meatless Mondays. So every Monday you're not eating any meat. It might seem like a really small thing that one day out of the week you're not eating meat, but it can really make a big difference. And we'll talk about it when we talk about food, but things like livestock have a very big ecological impact. but that'll be later down the line. You could also do things like drive less, carpool more, but it's just those little things. Take shorter showers, excuse me. These little things will add up over time. The other things, or for this, the big stuff was focused around that IPAT, so the formula on how we calculate this impact. One of the things is, what is affluence? So affluence just means wealth. So what kind of wealth does a country have? And you can also think of it, so in the formula, the way they measure that, it refers to the level of consumption by that population. So the more wealthy a country is, the more consumption they're going to have in that population. Also with that formula, the other thing is technology, and this is referring to the process to obtain resources and like how much waste and how much good is actually produced from that process. So that's what they mean about technology. It's not saying like, well, do they have computers or are they still writing on paper? Stuff like that. So it's how are they obtaining those resources? For this IPAT, for this impact formula, there is no really units that go along with it. And some of you asked, well, who actually uses this stuff? And a lot of times this formula is used when they're looking at population policies and things like, well, should we allow for this to happen or not? So that's what really economists will use this to calculate those types of things. The last thing in this set was biodiversity. So I talked about biodiversity and saying that we want a really high biodiversity. Biodiversity just means the variety of life in an ecosystem, in an area. So the higher the biodiversity, the more varied that life is. And that can be from us all the way down to microorganisms. So you want a big set of biodiversity instead of having an area that just has a few. And we'll talk about that more next unit when we get into ecosystems, and we'll actually look at biodiversity later on as well. So the last set is the environmental economics. So this dealt a lot with economics and had a lot of terms in it. So it was very term heavy. One of those was full cost pricing. And the full cost pricing is just when they take the internal and external costs, and I'll break those down here in a little bit, and they mix them together. So taking both of those into account when they're coming up with a final price for their products. In the long run, this would mean that things would probably cost a little bit more, but that's because they're actually taking into account external cost, which usually isn't factored in. So speaking of internal, external cost, so just a reminder, the internal costs are things like materials, energy, labor, equipment, the overheads that go into making a product. This can also be things like getting an oil change in your car or maintenance, anything like that all falls under internal costs. So things that you would usually think of when it comes to products. The external cost you can think of is the price that would be paid for the effects on the environment. So in that manufacturing, are they polluting? Are they creating something that isn't going to degrade? Are they creating something that they have to pay to get rid of, or that would cause the ecosystem to suffer in one way or another? Are they possibly polluting rivers, stuff like that? So that's our external costs. The external is the environmental stuff that it's really hard sometimes to put a value on. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. Another thing or another question that we had is, what's disparity, or what is meant by that? And disparity just means that there's a difference. So say an example is, if you made $100,000 and your neighbor made $20,000, we would call that a disparity in income. So when you see disparity, just think difference. The last thing was about the GPI, so the genuine progress indicator. Some of you asked if there's any countries that use this. There are a couple countries and actually states that use it as well. Canada is an example of this. Maryland uses it. Hawaii, Utah, they use this, or they use it in some way, shape, or form. So they haven't fully flipped to it because that's not the way that the economy has gone. They still use it, and they use it to um, get a better grasp on making decisions about different things. So instead of just looking at the monetary gain that would come from it, they also look at it and say, well, is this actually going to improve the lives of our citizens? In some places, they've actually changed the name to a happiness indicator, and looking at that and putting that over the monetary gain of, okay, well, how much money are we making from this? So um, there's a couple countries, not many, and it's going to take a lot of work to actually like overturn the GDP part of it. But overall, a lot of good questions. Um, Going forward, when you do stuff like this, I plan on making videos that will probably be posted on Saturdays as well. And this is just so that you can look over them at your own time and you don't have to worry about remembering what I said in class. You can come back to this at any time. If you have any other questions, please reach out on Schoology, or if you see me on Monday or Tuesday, ask me then. Have a good rest of your weekend. Bye.